The cantina on Outpost Vanguard served 47 different species and had exactly one rule posted in every known language: no weapons at the tables. Julian Reeves had always appreciated the optimism of that rule, given that at least a dozen species on station had built-in biological weapons that no security scan could confiscate. You couldn't exactly ask a Thurian to check their venomous spines at the door. He sat in his usual corner booth, absorbed in a technical manual about Quellan reproductive biology that was simultaneously fascinating and deeply weird. Quellans apparently stored genetic information in crystalline structures that reorganized based on environmental pheromones, which meant their offspring could have up to 7 biological contributors and still be genetically viable. Evolution had gotten creative with that species. The usual cantina noise hummed around him, overlapping conversations in multiple languages, the clink of various drinking vessels, the occasional argument about trade routes or sports, or which human music era was least offensive to non-human auditory systems. Julian had learned to filter it out months ago, the same way he'd learned to filter out the station's constant background hum of recycled air and artificial gravity. Then the noise stopped, not gradually, not like a conversation trailing off. It cut off like someone had activated a mute field, sudden and complete. Julian looked up from his manual and immediately understood why. Commander Zara'thix stood in the cantina entrance. She was Krev'nar, a species engineered for war back when genetic modification was less ethics committee and more arms race. 7 feet of dense muscle and reinforced bone structure. Her skin, a deep obsidian that caught the light in ways that suggested something harder than human flesh. Her ears swept back from her skull in elegant lines that would have been beautiful if they weren't so clearly designed for optimal sound triangulation in combat situations. Her face was all sharp angles and old scars, the kind that spelled out a biography of violence for anyone who knew how to read it. She wore light combat armor marked with Krev'nar military insignia and customized with the kind of wear patterns that came from actual use, not ceremonial display. A plasma blade hung at her hip, its presence somehow more threatening than if she'd been holding it drawn. Julian noticed all of this with the detached interest of a xenobiologist whose job was understanding how different species functioned. Then he noticed the cantina was emptying with remarkable speed. People found urgent reasons to be elsewhere, remembered appointments, sudden work emergencies, a pressing need to be literally anywhere but here. Within 30 seconds, the cantina had gone from comfortably full to almost empty. A few brave souls remained at tables near the exits, positioned for quick escape. Everyone else had vanished like smoke. Zara'thix's gaze swept the room with predator precision, cataloging threats and exits the way Julian cataloged genetic sequences. Her eyes were an unusual amber color, striking against her dark skin, and they held an intelligence that most people probably missed while they were busy being terrified. Julian, operating on the social protocols he'd developed over 18 months of working with dozens of species, did what he always did when someone entered a room. He made eye contact, offered a polite nod, and went back to his reading. He got maybe 3 words into the next paragraph before his hindbrain finally caught up with his forebrain and started screaming about the fact that he was alone in a cantina with the station's most dangerous resident, and she was walking toward him. Directly toward him. Julian's hand tightened on his datapad. He was a scientist, not a soldier. His idea of conflict resolution involved peer review and strongly worded emails. If Zara'thix decided to dismantle him, he'd have maybe 2 seconds to regret his life choices before ceasing to have the capacity for regret. She stopped beside his table. Up close, she was even more intimidating. Her armor carried the scent of weapon oil and something else, something sharp and chemical that might have been Krev'nar pheromones or might have been the residue of recent violence. Her shadow fell across his datapad, blocking the light. "Dr. Reeves," she said. Her voice was surprisingly controlled, deep and resonant but precise. He'd expected something aggressive, maybe threatening. Instead, it sounded almost formal. "Commander," he managed, and was proud that his voice only shook slightly. "Can I help you? May I sit?" Julian's brain short-circuited briefly. The most feared being on the station was asking permission, following social protocols, treating him like someone whose consent mattered rather than an obstacle to be removed. "Of course," he said, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. She sat with the kind of careful economy that suggested every movement was calculated for optimal efficiency. No wasted motion, no unnecessary adjustment. She simply transitioned from standing to seated in a way that somehow made the chair look fragile. They sat in silence for a moment. Julian could feel eyes on them from the remaining cantina occupants, from security feeds, probably from half the station. This would be gossip for weeks. The xenobiologist who sat with Commander Zara'thix and survived would be his legacy. "You are afraid," she observed. "Not a question, a statement of fact." "Terrified," Julian admitted. "But that's mostly biological programming. My species evolved as prey animals, relatively speaking. We're working on updating our threat response software, but evolution moves slowly. It's not personal." Something that might have been amusement flickered across her scarred face. The expression was gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "Yet you do not flee. Fleeing would be rude. You asked to sit. That suggests you want something other than violence, or you wouldn't have bothered asking." She tilted her head slightly, and her ears shifted in a way that his xenobiology training suggested indicated interest or evaluation. "You reason through fear," she said. "Not many do. Comes with the job. Can't study xenobiology if you panic every time you meet a new species." Another silence, longer this time. Julian became aware that his heart was still racing, that his palms were sweating, that every prey instinct he had was still screaming at him to run. But he'd learned years ago that interesting things happened when you didn't listen to fear's first suggestions. "I require assistance," Zara'thix said finally, and the words seemed to cost her something. "Understanding human cultural protocols. You are xenobiologist. You study how species function. I have question." Julian set down his datapad and gave her his full attention. "I'll help if I can. What do you need to know?" "Hayer Sates 1, Burlumu Yazdam, Shimdi 2 3v4, Burlumlari Yaziorum." The question Zara'thix asked wasn't what Julian expected. "Why do humans fear me beyond tactical assessment?" Julian blinked. Of all the things he'd anticipated, requests for information, threats disguised as inquiries, perhaps a strange Krev'nar cultural ritual that involved sitting in cantinas, this vulnerability caught him completely off guard. "You want to know why people are afraid of you specifically, not just Krev'nar in general." "I understand fear based on capability. I am superior combatant. Logical to maintain cautious distance." But she paused, and Julian noticed her hand had formed a fist on the table. Not threatening, just tense. "Humans flee before I speak, change corridors to avoid proximity. Conversations terminate upon my approach. This exceeds reasonable threat response." Julian leaned back and considered. This was actually a xenobiology question, just from an unexpected angle. Do Krev'nar study nonverbal communication? Body language, facial expressions, that sort of thing. "We study combat indicators, stance, weight distribution, preparation for attack or flight." "Right, but humans communicate constantly through nonverbal channels that have nothing to do with combat. Posture, expression, tone, proximity. We're sending and receiving social information all the time." Julian pulled up a display on his datapad, showing a basic human interaction diagram. "When you walk into a room, what's your posture?" Zara'thix demonstrated, and Julian had to suppress a reflexive flinch. Shoulders back, spine straight, head up, gaze direct and unblinking. Every line of her body radiated controlled danger. "That's a dominance posture in human social dynamics," Julian explained. "It signals aggression, challenge, potential threat." Add in your species' physical advantages and combat reputation, and you're basically walking around broadcasting. I could destroy everyone here and I'm considering it. Her ears twitched. I am not considering it. I know that now. But your body language doesn't communicate that to humans. We're reading threat signals you're not intentionally sending. For the next hour, Julian found himself giving an impromptu lecture on human social behavior to a warrior who listened with the intensity most people reserved for tactical briefings. She asked questions that revealed startling gaps. She didn't understand small talk, couldn't parse the difference between friendly interest and romantic interest, had no framework for casual social touch. On Krev'nar, she said at one point, physical contact is either combat or mating. There is no between. Humans have about 17 different categories of touch, Julian said. Handshakes, pats on the shoulder, hugs, high fives. Each means something different contextually. This seems inefficient. Welcome to humanity. We're a mess, but we're a highly social mess. When he finally asked why she'd chosen him for this conversation, Zara'thix was quiet for a long moment. The cantina had slowly refilled as people realized violence wasn't imminent, though everyone still maintained careful distance from their table. You are only being on station who looks at me and does not see weapon, she said finally. You see organism, subject of study. When you look at me, I feel, another pause longer this time, like person, not tool, not threat. Person, this is restful. Julian felt something shift in his chest. He'd spent his whole career studying how different species functioned, cataloging their differences and similarities. He'd never considered that being seen as a research subject might actually be validating to someone who was only ever seen as dangerous. Would you like to do this again? He asked. I can teach you about human social protocols, maybe help you understand why people react the way they do. Yes, Zara'thix said immediately. This would be acceptable. They established a routine after that. Every week, same time, same table. Julian taught her about human behavior, how to moderate her posture, how to make small talk, why humans smiled even when not amused. In exchange, she told him about Krev'nar culture, about a species engineered for war who'd never been given tools for peace, about growing up in combat creches where survival meant being faster, stronger, more ruthless than your peers, about a society that measured worth entirely in battlefield effectiveness. We are taught that emotion is weakness, she said during their third meeting. That connection beyond tactical cooperation compromises combat efficiency. But watching humans, I wonder if we were taught wrong. Your species forms bonds that make you stronger together, not weaker. Emotions are just data, Julian said. Your species decided they were inconvenient and bred for reduced emotional affect. Ours went the opposite direction. Neither approach is wrong, just different. You do not fear me anymore, Zara'thix observed. Julian considered. She was right. Somewhere between the first awkward conversation and now, his prey-animal hindbrain had recategorized her from threat to something else. Colleague, friend. The word felt inadequate but not wrong. I understand you better now, he said. Fear usually comes from not understanding the rules. You follow rules, they're just different rules than mine. Something that might have been satisfaction crossed her face. You are good teacher, Julian Reeves. It was the first time she'd used his first name. The station gossip network would have a field day with that. 3 months into their unlikely friendship, Julian realized that Zara'thix had started smiling, or at least, doing the Krev'nar equivalent, a slight softening around the eyes that he'd learned to recognize. She'd begun taking meals in the cantina at times that coincided with his schedule. She'd started asking questions that went beyond human social protocols into philosophy, art, the things that made life worth living beyond survival. And the station, slowly, had started to relax around her. Not completely. She was still Commander Zara'thix, still capable of dismantling most beings in hand-to-hand combat, but people had stopped fleeing when she entered rooms. Julian's mistake was working late and alone. His second mistake was not realizing the 3 Tarvek traders had been following him. His third and possibly final mistake was trying to reason with people who were too drunk and angry to care about reason. "You're the one," the lead Tarvek slurred, his translator rendering his speech in clipped, aggressive tones. "You're friends with the Krev'nar commander. Cost us 50,000 credits in seized shipments." "I'm a xenobiologist," Julian said, backing up slowly until he hit the lab counter. "I don't have anything to do with security operations or trade enforcement." "You talk to her, make her ease up. Tell her to look the other way." "That's not how it works. I can't tell Commander Zara'thix to ignore her duties, and even if I could, I wouldn't." The Tarvek's eyes narrowed, and Julian realized with sinking certainty that this situation was about to get very bad. Tarveks were shorter than humans but considerably stronger, with 4 arms that made them disturbingly effective in close combat. "Then maybe we send her a message," the leader said, and his companions moved to flank Julian. "Through you." Julian's academic brain noted clinically that he was about to experience significant trauma. His hands tightened on the edge of the lab counter behind him, searching for anything that might serve as an improvised weapon. A data slate, some collection tubes, nothing that would stop 3 drunk aliens intent on violence. The first blow caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. The second split his lip. He tried to defend himself with the kind of uncoordinated flailing that marked someone who'd never been in a fight, and managed only to make them angrier. Then the lab door opened. Zara'thix stood in the doorway, and Julian had never seen her in combat mode before. She'd always been controlled around him, careful, almost gentle in her movements. This was something else entirely. She moved like violence given form, like physics and brutality having a conversation in a language beyond words. The first Tarvek went down before he finished turning toward her, his knee joint bending in a direction evolution had never intended. The second managed to raise 2 of his arms defensively, before she broke them both with strikes so precise they looked choreographed. The third, the leader, pulled a plasma blade. Illegal on the station, but drunk logic rarely consulted regulations. Zara'thix disarmed him, literally, in a move that involved leverage, momentum, and a complete understanding of Tarvek physiology. The blade clattered across the floor. The trader screamed and collapsed, clutching his dislocated shoulder. The entire encounter took maybe 15 seconds. Zara'thix stood among the groaning traders, her breathing barely elevated, and turned to Julian. Her eyes swept over him, cataloging his injuries with the same precision she'd used to dismantle his attackers. "You are damaged," she said, and it wasn't a question. Julian pressed a hand to his ribs, which felt like they might be cracked, and tasted blood from his split lip. "I'm okay, you didn't have to." "I did." Her voice was flat, absolute. She crossed the lab in 3 strides and gripped his shoulders, examining his face with an intensity that made him self-conscious. "You are mine to protect." The possessiveness in her tone should have been alarming. Instead, it felt like safety wrapping around him like armor. She called station security, who arrived to collect the traders with the kind of weary professionalism that suggested this wasn't their first drunkalian violence call of the week. Then she took Julian to the medical bay, hovering while the human doctor treated his injuries with careful efficiency and very deliberate silence about the fact that Commander Zara'thix was radiating enough protective aggression to set off proximity alarms. Later, in Julian's quarters, because the doctor had prescribed rest and Zara'thix had apparently appointed herself his guardian, she explained, "In Krev'nar culture, we form Kethar, battle bonds." She stood by his window, silhouetted against the station's exterior lights. "When warrior finds someone whose spirit resonates with theirs, someone who sees them truly, Kethar forms. It is," she struggled with the translation, "sacred bond, pack bond, family." Julian adjusted the ice pack on his ribs and tried to process what she was saying. "You're saying we have a Kethar bond." "I am saying I offer Kethar. You may refuse. Kethar must be chosen by both. She turned to face him, and her amber eyes held something he'd never seen there before: vulnerability. You have given me gift I did not know existed for my kind. You treat me as person. You sit with me when others flee. You teach me how to exist in peace. This is, the familiar pause, beyond measure. Julian thought about the past 3 months, the weekly meetings that had become the highlight of his week. The way he'd started looking forward to seeing her, to their conversations that ranged from social protocols to philosophy. The way her presence had shifted from terrifying to comforting, how he'd learned to read her expressions that everyone else missed. "What does Kethar mean exactly?" he asked, in practical terms. "I defend you against all threats. I share resources. I consider your well-being equal to my own. In Krev'nar society, Kethar bonds are rarest and most valued relationship. They mark warriors who have found something worth protecting beyond tactical objectives. And if I accept, then you are mine and I am yours. We face universe as unit. This is permanent bond, Julian, not to be chosen lightly." He looked at her, this warrior who'd been engineered for violence but had chosen to sit with him week after week, learning how to be gentle, who destroyed 3 attackers in seconds to protect him, who looked at him now with hope and fear mingled in equal measure. "I accept," Julian said. The smile that transformed her scarred face was worth every bruised rib and split lip. She crossed the room and very carefully, with a gentleness that contradicted everything about her appearance, placed her palm against his in what he'd learned was a Krev'nar gesture of trust. "Kethar mine," she said softly. "I will not fail you." "I know," Julian said, and meant it completely. The Kethar bond changed everything and nothing. Zara'thix was still the most dangerous being on Outpost Vanguard, still walked with that controlled violence that made people nervous. But now there was context. The station crew noticed that she took meals in the cantina at precisely 1800 hours, the same time Julian finished his lab work. That she'd started attending xenobiology department lecture series, sitting in the back and asking questions that revealed a startling intelligence beneath the warrior exterior. She'd even started teaching combat classes, not to create soldiers, but to help civilians understand self-defense and situational awareness. Julian attended one out of curiosity and watched her demonstrate techniques with a patience that would have seemed impossible 4 months ago. "The goal is not to win," she told a class of nervous humans and aliens. "Goal is to survive long enough for help to arrive. You are not warriors. You do not need to be. You need to be smart." The station slowly, cautiously, began to see what Julian had seen from the beginning, that Commander Zara'thix was a person, not just a weapon. Then the Krev'nar battle cruiser arrived, and everything threatened to collapse. War leader Kethros came to retrieve her. He was everything Zara'thix could have become if she'd stayed in pure military culture: brilliant, brutal, utterly convinced that peace was weakness. His contempt for the multispecies outpost was evident in every word. Julian stood in the main docking bay with half the station, watching the confrontation. Kethros faced Zara'thix across 10 meters of deck plating, and the air between them felt charged with violence. "You have grown weak, Commander," Kethros said, his voice carrying across the bay. "You spend time with prey species. You teach civilians. You have forgotten what we are." "I have remembered what we could be," Zara'thix responded, and Julian heard something new in her voice: absolute certainty. "We are more than weapons. I have found Kethar here. I have found purpose beyond violence. I will not abandon it." Kethros's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Kethar, with a human, you shame yourself and our species. Perhaps I should eliminate your weakness for you." He moved toward Julian with killing intent, and Julian's hindbrain helpfully reminded him that he was about to die. But Zara'thix was faster. What followed was the kind of fight that would be analyzed in tactical databases for years. 2 Krev'nar warriors at peak capability, moving with speed and precision that made Julian's eyes hurt trying to track them. The bay erupted into chaos, people fleeing, security trying to get clear shots, alarms screaming. But Julian watched, unable to look away. He saw the difference immediately. Kethros fought to destroy, every move calculated for maximum damage. Zara'thix fought to protect, positioning herself between Kethros and Julian, redirecting his attacks, using his aggression against him. She was more dangerous because she had something worth fighting for. The fight ended with Kethros unconscious, his armor cracked, his pride shattered. Station security moved in cautiously to restrain him. The bay fell silent except for heavy breathing and the sound of Zara'thix's boots on deck plating as she crossed back to Julian. She was bleeding from a dozen wounds, her armor damaged but functional. She should have looked diminished. Instead, she looked glorious. "Are you well?" she asked, and Julian understood she wasn't asking about physical safety. He stepped forward and took her hand, her clawed fingers curling carefully around his human ones. Around them, the station watched and learned something important about courage. "I'm well," he said, "thanks to you." She told him later, in the medical bay while doctors repaired her injuries, what Kethar really meant. It means seeing someone for who they are, not what they were made to be. It means partnership. It means that warriors who find Kethar are most blessed because they have found reason to come home. Julian, who'd spent his career studying how different species functioned, realized he'd stopped cataloging and started living. The alien warrior no one dared approach had chosen him, and he'd chosen her back. They built something together that had no precedent in either culture, a bond based on mutual respect, emotional courage, and the revolutionary idea that even beings shaped entirely by war could choose peace when they found someone worth being peaceful for. The station watched their partnership and learned that human calm could reach anyone, that emotional courage mattered as much as physical bravery, that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could face wasn't violence but vulnerability. Zara'thix stood in the cantina doorway weeks later and people nodded to her, not from fear, from respect. She'd become part of the station's fabric, no longer just the feared commander but Zara'thix. Kethar bonded to the xenobiologist, teacher of self-defense, protector of those who couldn't protect themselves. Julian sat in their usual booth, reading about Thurian neuroplasticity, and looked up when her shadow fell across his datapad. She sat without asking now, comfortable in his space, and he slid a cup of the herbal tea she'd developed a taste for across the table. "Good day," he asked. 3 students asked questions after combat class. One asked about Krev'nar culture, not about weapons, about art. Her ears tilted forward with pleasure. "I told them about the war songs. They were interested." "Of course they were. You're interesting." She made the soft sound that was the Krev'nar equivalent of a laugh. "Only because you taught me how to let people see it. I just gave you vocabulary. You did the actual work." They sat in comfortable silence, and Julian reflected on how impossible this would have seemed 5 months ago. The feared warrior and the nervous scientist,